December 25th, 1991. The Kremlin. The red flag with the hammer and sickle descends for the final time. To the world watching on television, this looked like the triumph of democracy over tyranny. It looked like freedom defeating oppression. It looked like Reagan and Thatcher winning the Cold War. But if you had walked into the Ministry of Finance that morning, you would have seen a different scene entirely. Empty safes, bounced checks, and accountants with their heads in their hands. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of ideology. It didn't fall because of revolution. It went bankrupt. This is the story of the greatest insolvency in human history. A superpower with 40,000 nuclear warheads that couldn't afford to buy bread. An empire that bled out not on a battlefield, but on a balance sheet. Let's go back to when they thought they were invincible. The year is 1965. Soviet geologists are drilling in the frozen wastelands of western Siberia. The temperatures drop to minus 40 degrees. The equipment keeps freezing. And then they hit it. Oil. Not just a pocket of oil. An ocean of it. The Samatler Field. It was the third largest oil field ever discovered on Earth. At that moment, the Soviet leadership believed they had won the cosmic lottery. Their economy was already stagnating. Their factories produced televisions that exploded and cars that broke down after 6 months. Their collective farms were so inefficient that potatoes rotted in the fields. But now, none of that mattered. They didn't need to make good products. They just needed to drill holes in the frozen ground and watch the black gold flow. The 1970s arrived like a gift from the heavens. OPEC launched its oil embargo against the West. Prices skyrocketed from $3 a barrel to $35 a barrel. The Soviet Union became the world's largest oil producer. Billions of dollars in hard currency flooded into Moscow. Real money, dollars, marks, pounds. The kind of currency you could actually use to buy things outside your borders. The Kremlin looked at the revenue streams and saw endless power. They subsidized bread until it cost less than the paper it was wrapped in. They gave citizens apartments for almost nothing. They sent billions to Cuba, Vietnam, Angola, and every socialist movement on the planet. They built a military machine that consumed 20% of their entire GDP. They matched America missile for missile, tank for tank, submarine for submarine. To the world, the Soviet Union looked like a colossus. Parades in Red Square with endless columns of tanks. Cosmonauts orbiting the Earth. A superpower that seemed eternal. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. The oil money had become a narcotic. It masked every structural problem in the economy. Soviet industry stopped innovating because why bother when you can just sell oil? Soviet agriculture collapsed into total dysfunction, but it didn't matter because you could buy American wheat with oil money. The entire stability of the empire rested on one single variable. The price of a barrel of oil on the international market. As long as that number stayed above $30, the Soviet Union was a superpower. The moment that number dropped, the clock started ticking on their destruction. They had become a petrostate with nuclear weapons. A third-world economy wearing a first-world military costume. They were exporting raw materials and importing nearly everything else: food, medicine, technology, even the machines to drill for more oil. The Soviet Union had stopped making things the world wanted to buy. They had turned themselves into a giant gas station with an army, and gas stations don't build empires. They service them. The leadership in the Kremlin convinced themselves this was sustainable. Leonid Brezhnev, the general secretary, was aging and sick. His inner circle was a gerontocracy of men in their 70s. They didn't want to hear bad news. The economists who warned about the addiction to oil revenue were ignored or removed. The official reports showed growth. The propaganda celebrated triumph. But in the back rooms, the accountants were starting to sweat, because the numbers were beginning to tell a darker story. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was spending nearly half of its hard currency earnings just to import grain. Think about that for a moment. A nation that controlled some of the most fertile farmland on earth in Ukraine couldn't feed its own people. The collective farm system was so broken that the Soviet Union had become the world's largest importer of grain. And who were they buying it from? Their mortal enemy, the United States. Every year, massive cargo ships filled with American wheat sailed into Soviet ports. The Soviets paid in dollars earned from selling oil to Europe. It was a humiliating cycle of dependency, selling oil to buy bread. The empire was surviving on a credit card. And in the commodities markets of London and New York, the storm clouds were gathering. The United States and Saudi Arabia were watching carefully. They realized the Soviet bear had an Achilles heel: high oil prices. As long as oil stayed expensive, the Soviets could fund their empire. But what if the price dropped? In the early 80s, global oil demand began to fall. The West had become more energy efficient after the shocks of the 70s. Cars used less fuel. Buildings were better insulated. At the same time, new oil supplies came online from the North Sea and Alaska. The market was shifting, and then Saudi Arabia made a decision that would kill the Soviet Union. September 13th, 1985. Saudi oil minister Ahmed Zaki Yamani stood before the press and made an announcement. Saudi Arabia was tired of restricting production to prop up prices. They were going to open the taps and flood the market with cheap oil. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. In 1980, oil had traded at $35 a barrel. By mid-1986, it had crashed to $10 a barrel. For the Soviet Union, this was a death sentence. In the span of months, the empire lost half of its income. Imagine losing half your salary overnight while all your bills stayed the same. The Soviet budget had been calculated on the assumption of expensive oil. Suddenly, there was a gaping hole in the ledger. Tens of billions of dollars simply vanished. This happened at the worst possible moment. The Soviet Union was bogged down in a brutal war in Afghanistan that was costing millions of dollars every single day. They were propping up communist regimes in Cuba, Nicaragua, Ethiopia, and Angola. They were trying to match Ronald Reagan's Star Wars missile defense program. And they still had to buy the grain. The grain ships kept arriving at Odessa and Leningrad every week, demanding payment in hard currency. You couldn't pay with rubles. The ruble was worthless outside Soviet borders. It was a soft currency, monopoly money. You needed real money, dollars or gold. Mikhail Gorbachev entered the Kremlin in March of 1985. He was 54 years old, young by Soviet standards. He was energetic, reform-minded, and intelligent. He knew the system was stagnant and needed restructuring. He launched a program called Perestroika, which meant restructuring. He wanted to modernize Soviet industry and make it competitive. To fund this transformation, he needed cash. He looked at the budget projections and assumed the oil revenue would be there. He was catastrophically wrong. The oil price collapse ripped the financial foundation out from under him before he could even begin. Gorbachev faced an impossible choice. He could cut military spending, which would enrage the generals and weaken Soviet power. He could cut food subsidies, which would cause riots in the streets. Or he could borrow. He chose to borrow. The Soviet Union began taking out massive loans from Western banks. German banks, French banks, British banks. The bankers were happy to lend. This was a superpower with vast resources and a perfect credit rating. They had gold reserves. They had oil fields. They seemed like the safest bet in the world. So the money flowed in. But this wasn't investment capital going into factories or infrastructure. This was survival money. The Soviets were borrowing billions just to buy food and keep the store shelves from looking completely empty. It was a credit card spiral. They were borrowing to eat. And then Gorbachev made a domestic policy mistake that accelerated the collapse. He launched an anti-alcohol campaign in 1985. He saw that vodka was destroying the health and productivity of Soviet workers. So he restricted sales, closed distilleries, and ordered vineyards destroyed. Morally, it seemed like the right thing to do. Economically, it was suicide. The state tax on vodka was one of the largest sources of government revenue, second only to oil. By restricting vodka sales, Gorbachev wiped out another enormous chunk of the budget. And the people didn't stop drinking. They just started brewing moonshine at home. Bathtub vodka, the state got zero revenue. Sugar disappeared from the stores because people were buying it all to ferment alcohol. The treasury was hemorrhaging from two wounds now: collapsing oil prices and vanishing alcohol taxes. By 1988, the deficit was spiraling completely out of control. The government started doing the one thing you should never do when you're going broke. They turned on the printing presses. They printed rubles to pay workers' wages and pensions. But because there were almost no goods in the shops to buy, the money just accumulated. This created what economists call a monetary overhang. People had pockets full of cash, but the stores were empty. The shortage economy kicked into overdrive. Citizens would stand in line for 4 hours just for a loaf of bread. If they saw a line forming, they would join it without even asking what was being sold. It might be shoes. It might be sausages. It might be toilet paper. You grabbed whatever you could, because tomorrow it would be gone. The social contract was breaking. Soviet citizens had tolerated the lack of political freedom because the state provided stability. Cheap rent, guaranteed employment, subsidized food. Now the stability was gone. The shelves were bare. The money was worthless, and the West was watching with increasing alarm. The banks in London and Frankfurt started to get nervous. They noticed that the Soviet Union was now borrowing just to pay the interest on previous loans. The debt had exploded from almost nothing to over $50 billion in just a few years. The bankers realized the emperor had no clothes. More importantly, he had no cash. 1989. The Berlin Wall fell. The satellite states of Eastern Europe broke free. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania. To the world, this looked like a political liberation. To the accountants in Moscow, it was a financial catastrophe. For decades, the Soviet Union had forced Eastern Europe to trade in a closed economic system called Comecon. The Soviets would send oil and receive manufactured goods in return, all priced in rubles. Now those countries demanded to be paid in dollars for their goods. The entire trading system collapsed overnight. The Soviet Empire wasn't just losing territory. It was losing captive markets and subsidized supply chains. Inside the Kremlin, panic set in. The gold reserves were vanishing. In the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union had supposedly possessed over 2,000 tons of gold bars in the state vaults. By 1990, they were secretly flying gold to London and Zurich, selling it in desperation just to pay for the next shipment of wheat. They sold so much gold so quickly that they depressed the global gold price, getting even less value for their desperation sales. The legendary Soviet gold reserves were being liquidated in a fire sale. And then the War of Laws began. This was the final internal blow that shattered any hope of recovery. The Soviet republics, Russia, Ukraine, the Baltic states, started to withhold tax revenue from the central government. Boris Yeltsin, the leader of the Russian Republic, told his tax collectors to keep the money in Russia. Don't send it to Gorbachev in Moscow. The Central Soviet budget evaporated. Gorbachev was officially the president of a superpower, but he had no income. He commanded 40,000 nuclear warheads, but he couldn't pay the soldiers who guarded them. Sovereignty is solvency. And the Soviet Union was insolvent. In 1990, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union started defaulting on its commercial payments. Ships full of frozen meat and butter would anchor off the coast of Leningrad and refuse to unload. The captains radioed that they wouldn't dock until the checks cleared. But the checks were bouncing. The Soviet government, which had launched Sputnik and built an empire, was now begging for credit extensions on food shipments. They went to the West with their hands out. They asked for humanitarian aid. It was a humiliation beyond measure. The nation that had defeated Nazi Germany was now asking Germany for care packages of powdered milk and canned beef. The Vienna Bank, the Soviet Bank for Foreign Economic Affairs, froze all hard currency accounts in November of 1990. Soviet companies that had earned dollars through export trade woke up one morning to find their accounts empty. The state had confiscated every dollar to pay the national debt. It was theft on a national scale. Trust was completely destroyed. The ruble ceased to function as money. The Soviet economy reverted to barter. Factories paid their workers in whatever they produced: tires, crystal glasses, light bulbs. Workers would then stand on the side of the road trying to trade a set of tires for a bag of potatoes. The black market became the only real market. The dollar became the only real currency. Taxi drivers and hotel doormen became the new elite because they had access to foreign cash. Professors and rocket scientists became paupers. August 19, 1991. Hardline communists launched a desperate coup against Gorbachev. They put him under house arrest in Crimea. They sent tanks into Red Square. They wanted to restore order and turn back the clock. They wanted to save the Soviet Union. But they forgot one crucial thing. You can't shoot economics. The coup leaders didn't have a plan to fix the debt. They didn't have a plan to put food on the shelves. They didn't have a plan to make the ruble worth anything. The coup collapsed after 3 days, not just because people resisted, but because the plotters realized they were fighting for the captain's chair on a sinking ship, and the ship was already under water. When Gorbachev returned to Moscow after the coup, he was a ghost. The real power had shifted to Boris Yeltsin and the republics, but the debt remained. $70 billion owed to Western banks and governments. The creditors were terrified. If the Soviet Union broke apart, who would pay the debt? Would Russia pay? Would Ukraine pay? Would Kazakhstan pay? The Western banks and the G7 countries called emergency meetings. They demanded a joint and several responsibility agreement. They told the republics, we don't care who's in charge, but someone has to sign for this debt. Someone has to be responsible. In the final months of 1991, the Soviet Union existed only on paper. There was no money for the November payroll. There was no money for December. The printing presses ran 24 hours a day, churning out high-denomination bank notes that were worth less than the paper they were printed on. Hyperinflation had arrived. Prices doubled every few weeks. Life savings evaporated. Pensions became worthless. December 25, 1991. The end of the line. The central bank of the Soviet Union, Gosbank, was completely insolvent. They had literally run out of gold. Investigating prosecutors later discovered that only about 240 tons of gold remained in the vaults. The rest had been sold, stolen, or wasted in a desperate attempt to keep the system alive for just one more month. Mikhail Gorbachev sat at his desk to sign his resignation. He didn't resign because he was defeated by an invading army. He didn't resign because of a revolution in the streets. He resigned because he had lost the ability to pay bills. The Soviet Union officially ceased to exist, but the ghost of the empire lingered in the ledger books. The new Russian Federation, led by Boris Yeltsin, inherited the seat at the United Nations. It inherited the nuclear codes, and it inherited the debt. Russia agreed to take on 100% of the Soviet Union's foreign debt in exchange for claiming all of the Soviet Union's foreign assets. The embassies, the gold, the foreign bank accounts. It was called the Zero Option Deal. This debt burden crushed the new Russia throughout the entire 1990s. The democratic government was strangled by interest payments on loans taken out by the communists. There was no money to cushion the economic transition. Subsidies were slashed overnight. Prices for food skyrocketed by over 2,000% in a single year. The life savings of millions of ordinary Russians were wiped out in a matter of days. Pensioners who had worked their entire lives found their savings wouldn't buy a loaf of bread. The poverty that followed was horrific. Entire cities went without heat in the winter. Salaries went unpaid for months. But this suffering wasn't caused by the collapse of 1991. It was caused by the addiction of the 1970s. The pain of the 90s was the withdrawal symptom from the oil high.